Welcome to the Great Loop Radio podcast, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Our topic today is AGLCA's advocacy efforts on your behalf, and we're going to focus mostly on Florida, which tends to be the hotbed of our advocacy efforts because a lot seems to go on there regarding boating regulation and legislation. So Karen Nettles from the Homeport crew will be joining me once again. She'll help us walk through everything that's happening so far in 2025. In the meantime, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Great Loop Yacht Sales, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. And with the business out of the way, Karen Nettles, welcome back. Thanks for joining me today.
Oh, always glad to be on the podcast with you.
And I know you're going to help me now try and get the details. Lots of details, lots of history here. So go ahead, fire away. Where should we start?
Yeah, obviously, advocacy is something we have ongoing, and we have a big push at the beginning of the year, and there's a lot of activity at the beginning of the year. I know Florida is a perennial focus for our advocacy efforts, so can we just get started there and tell us why?
Yeah, the issues in Florida, it is the perennial hotbed of issues. I would say it started about 10 years ago, when we started to see some anti-anchoring legislation put forth in Florida. I think then it was really an effort by some waterfront homeowners who just didn't enjoy looking and seeing boats in their waterfront view and started to really push to ban overnight anchoring. So initially, and again, this is about 10 years ago, I'd say, a few small pockets were lost to anchoring where overnight anchoring was disallowed. Only the state can regulate anchoring in Florida. So we avoid individual counties, individual towns from coming in and passing their own anchoring regulations. And if you've anchored in a town or in a municipality and had law enforcement approach you and say there's a local ordinance, that ordinance is against state law, and we'd love to hear about it so we can help resolve that. But initially it was four or so small pockets that were closed to overnight anchoring. Boating organizations engaged to prevent losing more ground there. And we've been successful in doing that now for about 10 years. But the issue has also shifted a lot because, as I said, I think it was initially an effort by waterfront homeowners who just didn't want their view spoiled by boats. But it has really since then become kind of a derelict vessel issue where there are vessels that are derelict. There are lots of vessels that are at risk. If those anchors come loose, if a storm comes through, those end up potentially harming the environment and harming other boats or other people's property. And that is a real concern. We certainly don't support homeowners just not wanting boats in their view. That's not okay. But we do support clearing the waterways of derelict vessels. But unfortunately, in some of these anchoring proposed bills that have come up over the years, the responsible cruisers who are just anchoring for convenience, for safety, for pleasure, are being kind of caught up in what is really an attack on derelict vessels. So that's really become the challenge. About 3 years ago now, a lot of the parties, the stakeholders kind of came around the table and kind of brokered an agreement that became a bill and was eventually signed into law, where we came up with the concept of anchoring limitation areas. Under an anchoring limitation area, they're designated at the county level. So a county has to apply to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, who regulates boating, to establish an anchoring limitation area or an ALA. The ALAs are limited to no more than 10% of the county's waterways. Each individual ALA cannot be more than 100 acres in size. And what happens with an ALA, an anchoring limitation area, is that boats can stay there for up to 45 days. After that, they have to move on. So for a transiting cruiser, an ALA is almost immaterial because most of us are not staying at anchor for 45 days anywhere. So even if we choose to drop the hook in an anchoring limitation area, there's no impact for us as long as we leave within those 45 days. So for the cruising community, the true active boaters, this was a win. We expected that to kind of solve this year after year battle. And as part of that, the few places that were already closed to overnight anchoring were grandfathered in. So that's where it stood, and that's where it has stood for kind of recent years. That's a really quick overview of a pretty complex history on this, but I really want to focus a little bit more on the more recent past. So let's pick it up there.
Okay. Well, like I said, you mentioned the ALAs that were set up. So what's happened since then?
So, as I said, the we kind of expected that or hoped that that would be the end of this year after year battle. Sadly, it's not. South Florida, in particular, in the Biscayne Bay area, has continued to file bills that would add to those areas where overnight anchoring is completely restricted, even though that section of the code was kind of grandfathered as the word that was used at the time. Um, so last year we had to fight back against several bills that were filed that would close more areas to overnight anchoring. If you have followed news out of the Miami area, especially boating news, you've probably come across some of the battles happening in Miami Beach, where there is a city council member who very aggressively is anti-anchoring in Biscayne Bay. And the state legislative delegation for that area, a few bills came out from some of their representatives and senators last year. One would have eliminated anchoring within 200 yards of Miami Beach shoreline, which was something we fought hard against. We ended up in the end, that was removed from the bill, and instead, a few more small pockets were lost to overnight anchoring. These are in the Venetian Islands in Biscayne Bay. If you look at a map of Biscayne Bay, you can see these non-naturally shaped islands that are kind of there in Biscayne Bay and were man-made. Um, Anchoring between a few more of those became restricted or unavailable for overnight anchoring last year, which we were upset to lose more ground, but that solution was they were not viable anchorages as far as we're concerned anyway, and it was a better solution than risking losing any anchorages within 200 yards of Miami Beach shoreline, especially because once you get beyond that distance in Biscayne Bay, you start to run into shallow depths that can make it challenging to anchor. Um, my Biscayne Bay, it's just an interesting place that Miami Beach has really aggressively fought anchoring in the area. And since only the state can pass anchoring regulations, Miami Beach doesn't have the power on its own to ban anchoring. So instead, they've made it really challenging by closing shoreside facilities. So they've closed some of the dinghy docks, and others they have made exorbitant pricing for landing permits to land your dinghy. So it's really been an attack on the boaters in Biscayne Bay. There are a lot of boats at anchor in Biscayne Bay, some very long term, some long term stored. Um, that's a problem too. Dockage in that area of Florida has become scarce. So it's not necessarily a derelict vessel issue if a boat is long term stored at anchor. It's potentially just that there are no slips. So it's a really complex issue. It kind of morphs with a housing issue because there are people who live aboard full time in Biscayne Bay. It's an affordable way to live in that area. So lots of issues tied together with that. I would call last year, a win because we fought back most of the bills. We did just lose a couple more of the Venetian islands. So that's kind of a recap of last season. Um, and,
Well,
you
what,
know, like I said, I consider it a win, but it wasn't ideal.
of course, what about bills that have already been filed in Florida for this year? Are there others that are trying to further restrict anchoring?
There absolutely are, and that is why we are so engaged in Florida. The legislature has not started to meet yet. They've started their committee meetings, and bills have started to be filed. There are two that we are absolutely opposed to and are working to fight those already. One, and if you want to look these up, of course, one in Florida is HB 481. It does a couple of things. One is that it adds the rest of those Venetian islands I mentioned, the space between them. It adds those to the places where overnight anchoring is banned. But the second thing and the more damaging thing is that it limits anchoring to 30 days within any 6 month period in a county. So essentially, after 30 days, you would have to move on. Very few of our members anchor for 30 days, but since this is for a county, it is feasible that some of our members would be kind of bouncing around one area, dropping the hook, and potentially, particularly if they're not currently on the loop, but doing some snowbird type cruising, they could be heading north in the spring, and then south later on to head back towards Florida and could be coming through this area more than once. So it's a bad bill. There's a lot of problems with the language of the bill, and it does a lot to really restrict anchoring in a way that's not viable for even transient cruisers, but certainly not viable for people who are long term in Florida. So that's why we're opposed to that one, and we are working that through the channels we'll discuss in a little while. The other one we're opposed to, but still studying, um, is Senate Bill 592. This one, the concern is the distance it bans, and this is a seaport bill. There are a lot of seaports in Florida, 16, I believe. And this bill would ban anchoring within 5,000 feet of any of that seaport. 5,000 feet, for those of you who are distance challenged like me, is pretty close to a mile. So it would basically ban anchoring for close to a mile from any of 16 seaports. These include seaports like Jacksonville, Port Canaveral, Fort Pierce, Palm Beach, Port Everglades, Miami, Key West, several others, Tampa, Port St. Joe, lots that loopers are going through. Um, so on the surface, it's a bad bill. We are certainly in favor of our ports being secure, but we need to make sure that the right to anchor is still there for safety. It's part of the right to navigation, and for safety, for convenience, we just need to make sure that this is um, not going to impede our members' ability to safely do the loop. So we are studying this. Um, One thing we're still looking at is if we map out, and somebody on our team is doing this, if we map the 5,000 feet from the port facilities, what documented anchorages are lost by that. And it looks like the impact is really not as extreme as it sounds. Our early look is that there are active usable anchorages that would be lost in Fernandina, Lake Worth, Fort Pierce, Miami, and Key West. So 6 or so of the 16 would have an impact on cruisers. The others don't appear to have any good anchorages near their port terminals. So it might not be as bad as it seems on the surface. But again, it seems that every time we give a little bit in Florida, the next year they're coming back asking for more. So we're working this bill. We are opposed to the bill as it stands, but probably more to come on that one if it is not amended.
Okay, so in addition to doing the studies, you're working that to see what comes out. So there's also one bill that we support, correct? Can you tell us about that one and what makes it different?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was pretty recently released, but Senate Bill 164, we do support. We know that there are some other groups out there kind of pretty loudly opposing this one. Um, there's still some fact finding going on, but we do support this bill as it stands today. Senate Bill 164 goes in the direction very similar to something that the state of Georgia did a few years ago, and we were pretty active in that process in Georgia. It establishes long term anchoring permits. So, if this bill were to pass as is, you would be able to anchor for up to 14 days in a 30-day period within 1 mile of a documented anchoring spot. So, you anchor, you can stay for up to 14 days, no problem whatsoever. After the 14 days, you need a permit. Now, the first question everybody I explain is to ask is, well, oh, great. Well, how much is the permit going to cost me? It is documented in the bill that the permit must be free of charge. So it's a free permit. The bill does, explain that you would have to provide details like your name, your address, your contact information, the hull number, some identifying information about the boat. Um, and that would be submitted to obtain the permit. So it really addresses the issue of derelict or soon to be derelict vessels, because part of the problem is some of these boats appear to be abandoned. There's hull numbers scraped off. There's no good way to identify the responsible party. So this really moves to hold people accountable for their vessels. Um, and it really kind of gives law enforcement information about who is permitted to be there, and if the boat is neglected and at risk of becoming derelict, they can follow up with the accountable party. So we think it's a good bill. We think the 14 days is enough for transiting cruisers, and that's where it stands today.
Is there anything else you're still learning about the bill?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we are kind of still working through this. We're talking with the bill sponsor to try and get some of the whys behind, what problem are we solving here? As I said, I believe this was really written to address the derelict vessel issue and the long-term stored vessels that's later become at risk of becoming derelict. Um, what we're trying to focus on is determining kind of the logistics, if you will, for a transiting cruiser. So most transiting cruisers are not going to stay for more than 14 days in one place. But there are sometimes circumstances, a mechanical breakdown, waiting for a weather window to cross to the Bahamas that perhaps you expected to stay, for 10 days and then bad weather rolled in. We need to understand the process for getting a permit. If it requires a waiting period and a shore access, that's a problem. As I said, if there's a boat that's been there for 10 days and is now waiting for a weather window and bad weather rolls in, may not be safe for them to move the mile required without a permit, or there may not be a way for them to safely get to shore if it requires that. And if it takes 2 weeks to get the permit, then there's a problem there as well. So we really need to understand the process and what happens to somebody, who really wasn't planning on exceeding the 14 days, but circumstances may dictate that they have to. We're hoping it's an online process that is immediate. It does not appear from the bill that there's an approval needed. It's just an information providing type action. So hopefully it is digital. Hopefully it is immediate. And then the other questions we have are surrounding the process for law enforcement to know if you have one, so that if you're sitting there and there's 20 boats anchored, how does the law enforcement agent know which ones are permitted to be there and which ones are not? So those are the types of questions that we're hoping to get answered. I believe the bill leaves that somewhat vague because it is up to Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission to set the rules to implement this. But we're hoping to at least gather some data on what the intention is and what FWC might do with this. Again, if it is a digital and immediate permit, then even a cruiser caught unexpectedly going into their 15th day has the ability to abide by the regulation if it can be done quickly and digitally. So that's where that stands. Absolutely more to come on this as well. These bills are not even at the point where committees are starting to consider them because we're still kind of in the pre-session. So definitely we will keep you posted.
And definitely a lot of legislative activity still to come. Like you said, these are pre-bills that have been filed and so forth. So you kind of track, taking a proactive approach. But we also need our members to help with this. So how can they help?
We absolutely do. And right this minute, what we need most from our members and from the boating community at large, or anyone who listens and appreciates the content in this podcast, we need money to support our advocacy efforts. Our goal this year is to raise $38,000. We are currently sitting at about $15,500, so we have got a ways to go. I wish I could tell you this could all be done by a grassroots effort, but it cannot, and it's not as effective for us to proceed in that way. So if you go to greatloop.org, that's AGLCA's website, it's greatloop.org/advocacy. You will get more information and a link to help contribute. Any amount is welcome. And beyond that, this will reach a point, I'm quite certain, where we will need that grassroots effort. So we'll likely be putting out alerts for calls and emails to key legislators as the committees start considering these bills. So please be on the lookout for those and help us with that if you can.
Okay. And we know a large chunk of the contributions that come in goes to a lobbyist. So why do we need a lobbyist to help with these issues?
Yep, the vast majority of our budget for advocacy goes directly to pay for our lobbyist contract in Florida. Our lobbyist, we've retained one for several years. It has been a highly successful process for us. Frankly, we can't fight this battle without the inside contacts that our lobbyist has with legislators in Florida. Um, we do not go out kicking and screaming and complaining about, all of the things that the legislators are doing wrong. We take a very consultative approach. Most of them are not boaters, so we try to educate them on the issues on the waterway, and we find that they're pretty receptive to that approach where we go in, you know, offering to help them understand the issues and the impact of potential legislation on boaters. Because of that, we were reached out to by some of the Senate leadership prior to this Senate bill that we are supporting coming out. Um, we discussed with them the Georgia effort, and obviously Florida is very different than Georgia, but that this long-term permit for anchoring had happened there. Um, that's how we can be successful. It's a very much behind the scenes effort. Um, and our lobbyist has done a great job for us. So, brokering some of these deals, for better or for worse, and like it or not, a lot of it happens behind the scenes. And it all happens with professional and courteous contact. And that's where our lobbyist is just instrumental. We wish it didn't cost as much, but we believe it is worth every penny.
Speaking of the cost, does AGLCA fund the entire cost of the lobbyist?
We do not, but at this point, we fund the lion's share. So we are partnered with a few other recreational boating associations that whose members do the same type of long distance cruising as AGLCA. So that is Marine Trawler Owners Association, Seven Seas Cruising Association, and the Fever Cruisers Association. So the four organizations have teamed to contract with the lobbyist. We've always split the cost based on the number of members each group has. So we kind of divide the total cost by the total members across all four organizations to determine our fundraising goal. AGLCA at this point accounts for like 75% of the total members across those four organizations. So we're paying, as I said, kind of the lion's share of that bill. So we just really need all boaters who care about this, but especially our members, to engage on this and to help us fund that, because AGLCA essentially is getting billed for each and every member, and we need everybody to step up and help.
Yeah, all voters for sure. Um, Florida is a hotbed, and it's not the only state that we monitor. So, can you tell us what other states have bills that can affect, the Great Loop route and the waterways of the Great Loop?
We absolutely can, but I just realized we have not taken our break to recognize and hear a message from one of our sponsors. So let's do that, and we'll come back then and jump into some of the other bills. So we'll be back in a moment. Our friends at Argo Navigation have created a free boating app that gives AGLCA boaters an easier way to plan their trip, navigate safely, and share information with fellow loopers. Argo has nautical chart coverage throughout North America, auto or manual routing, depths and tracks to avoid shallow water, trip details while en route, and a captain's log to save everything. You can also see other boaters, message them, and share experiences with in-app social features. Coming soon is a premium version with weather, wind, tides, offline charts, and more. Download the Argo Boating app on the App Store or Google Play. Discover Cypress Landing, your Inner Banks home port on Chakawinity Bay. Boat, golf, live, and play in North Carolina's friendliest community with 700 custom homes, a picturesque 220 slip marina, and the number 8 ranked state public golf course set among forests, lakes, streams, and wildlife. This award-winning community offers golf, event activities, and stellar facilities from a fitness center, swimming pools, and miles of trails to tennis, pickleball, and more. 60 miles upstream from the Outer Banks and ICW, away from urban congestion but near necessities, Cypress Landing invites the Looper community to discover home, where active lifestyle meets southern hospitality. We're back on the Great Loop Radio podcast. Today we are talking about AGLCA's advocacy efforts. We've been focusing a lot on the state of Florida because that is where most of it happens. Karen Nettles from the Homeport crew is with me. Karen, where did we leave off on that?
We were going to pick up with other states. It said that, we follow things and monitor things in Florida, but there's other states on the Great Loop that are impacted with other bills as well. So can you give us an update on those?
Yeah, we do monitor the bills happening in every state around the loop. And this is the time of year where all of those legislators are starting to meet, starting to pre-file bills. Karen does a lot of this for us, is kind of weed through those bills and see which ones might need our attention. There's been a few we've seen come across our desks that address defining derelict vessels and right to remove derelict vessels. We support anything like that. We find that non-controversial at this point. Probably one of the biggest ones that kind of got our attention is in South Carolina. This is the second year in a row that a similar bill was filed. Last year it did not progress. But this one would require boaters to maintain marine recovery insurance if they want to stay at anchor. I believe it's for more than 30 days on South Carolina waters. Um, so that's problematic, especially because some of the terms of the bill require surveys that boaters don't necessarily already have. So while we're not against the idea that you should be held responsible and accountable for your boat should something go wrong and should it affect the marine environment, some of the particulars of the bill require it for a fairly short stay. And even a boater transiting the waters of South Carolina could potentially anchor in South Carolina waters for more than the allotted number of days. So that's, kind of forcing a transiting boater to show proof of this insurance and potentially have a survey. Um, and it's not the insurance company requiring the survey, it's actually the state of South Carolina would require it. Then there's specific stickers that the insurance companies have to issue. Last year, the insurance companies were not on board with this. Marine recovery insurance, from my understanding with discussing this with some of our insurance expert sponsors, is really not a thing. The verbiage is off, but it's also not really a standalone kind of policy that you can purchase. And then the survey requirements in the bill are different than survey requirements by the insurance companies. And that really needs to be aligned. Last year, the insurance companies in South Carolina, basically said they would have no way of complying with the bill or offering what the bill requires and no process by which to send these specific stickers that are required to be on the boat. So we're following that one. If it does start to progress in committee, we certainly will engage on that. Right now, we're just kind of monitoring. Last year, it kind of took care of itself because local state officials in insurance and in the marine industry kind of pointed out the problems with the bill, and then it just failed to make any progress. So hopefully that'll take care of itself again. If not, we will certainly engage on that. We've seen a couple of bills that would require different things of boaters. We reach out to legislators for clarification if we have any uncertainty. There was one in Tennessee this year that would require some additional permitting or registration in Tennessee for boats not registered there. It was kind of convoluted. We reached out directly to the legislator who was the sponsor of the bill to try and gauge what the intention is and how this would impact loopers. And it turned out he was only talking about landlocked lakes. It had nothing to do with the Tennessee River or any other parts of Tennessee that a looper boat would be crossing. So these are the kind of things we do behind the scenes. This is what we're doing to support members. I know a question that comes up since we have a couple minutes left, the debate comes up a lot. Well, this is important, but a lot of members are not contributing. So why don't we make it part of membership dues? That is certainly on the table. And, our costs have gone up for our lobbyists this year. So our goal is higher than ever. If we struggle to reach that, that will most certainly be on the table for 2026. We have always taken this as an optional approach because we know that not all members agree on all of the issues. And so, therefore, it leaves it kind of up to the individual member if they want to contribute to it. Beyond that, of our 6,300 active memberships, there is a percentage that are lifetime members, so we have no recurring way to bill them for something, so they would be exempted from it. And then we also have a whole series of 2-year members and 3-year members. So by adding it to membership dues, there's some logistics we would have to figure out, certainly on the table for future years. But I know it's a question that kind of begs to be asked because it is an excellent point and it is something we're going to continue to review. So that is the update as of today. If we get a lot of changes, we will certainly be keeping members and others updated through our website, through our social media channels. If there are any big changes, we will put out another podcast this year to update everyone who's listening.
Okay. And as we wrap up, can you remind us again how listeners can help with the advocacy efforts?
Yes, and we hope that many of them will. Again, any amount is welcome. No amount is too small. If you visit greatloop.org/advocacy, you will land right to a page that will explain more about our efforts and also give you a link to contribute. So we hope many of you will do that, and we look forward to bringing you the updates as we continue down this path for 2025. I think that is all we have for you for today. Karen, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you helping guide us through this.
Oh, no problem.
And to anyone who has watched or listened today, We thank you for that. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Great Loop Radio podcast. Until then, safe cruising.